Hi there. Thanks for watching my video all the way through. My goal is to get 1,000 subscribers to my YouTube channel. If you like this kind of content, please subscribe. I'd really appreciate it. Let's move on to the stories. Story 1. The abandoned house on the outskirts of town. I've always loved exploring abandoned places. There was something alluring about them, something that drew me in with their mystery and history. One day I heard about an old house on the outskirts of our town. They said it was built at the beginning of the last century and had been abandoned for a long time. The locals avoided it, claiming that strange things happened there. One cold autumn evening, I decided to go there. The house stood on a hill, surrounded by a dense forest. As I approached, I felt a cold wind brush down my spine. The door was slightly open, and I cautiously stepped inside. Inside, it was dark and damp. The floors creaked beneath my feet, and the walls were covered in mold. I turned on my flashlight and began to inspect the rooms. Each of them held something strange: old photographs on the walls, broken furniture, scattered toys. It seemed as if the house had frozen in time. In one of the rooms, I found an old diary. It belonged to a girl named Anna, who had lived there many years ago. I began to read it and learned that Anna often saw strange shadows and heard whispers at night. She wrote that the house was cursed and that something evil dwelled within its walls. Suddenly, I heard a rustling sound behind me. Turning around, I saw a shadow flicker in the corner of the room. My heart started beating faster, and I felt fear creeping over me. I decided it was time to leave, but when I approached the door, it slammed shut in front of me. I tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Suddenly, I heard a whisper coming from the darkness. It grew louder and louder until it turned into a scream. I felt something cold touch my hand, and I jumped back in terror. My flashlight slipped from my hand and rolled across the floor, illuminating the room. In its light, I saw the figure of a girl standing in the corner. Her eyes were empty, and her face was twisted in horror. She reached out to me and whispered, "Help me." I couldn't move. Fear paralyzed me. The girl began to approach, and I felt cold enveloping my entire body. Suddenly, the door flew open, and I ran out of the house without looking back. When I got home, it took me a long time to recover. I knew I would never return to that house again, but every time I close my eyes, I see her face and hear her whisper. And I know that she is still waiting for me there in the darkness. Weeks passed, but I couldn't forget that house. I decided to go back to figure out what was going on. This time, I took a camera and a voice recorder to capture everything I saw and heard. When I entered the house again, I felt the cold envelop me. I began to explore the rooms, recording everything on camera. Suddenly, I heard a rustling sound behind me. Turning around, I saw a shadow flicker in the corner of the room. My heart started beating faster, and I felt fear creeping over me. I decided to go upstairs. The stairs creaked beneath my feet, and I felt as though something invisible was watching me. On the second floor, I found an old nursery. There was a bed in the corner, and old toys hung on the walls. I turned on the voice recorder and began asking questions, hoping to get answers. Suddenly, I heard a whisper. It was coming from the corner of the room. I pointed the camera there and saw the figure of the girl. She was standing there, staring at me with empty eyes. I felt the cold envelop my entire body. The girl began to approach, and I heard her whisper, "Help me." I couldn't move. Fear paralyzed me. The girl came closer and reached out her hand to me. I felt something cold touch my hand, and I jumped back in terror. Suddenly, the door flew open, and I ran out of the house without looking back. When I got home, it took me a long time to recover. I knew I would never return to that house again. But every time I close my eyes, I see her face and hear her whisper, and I know that she is still waiting for me there in the darkness. Story 2. The abandoned house on the edge of the forest. I've always loved walking in nature, especially in wild, unexplored places where few people have set foot. On that autumn day, when I decided to hike along the edge of an old forest, I felt great. Towering fir trees surrounded me, their tops barely visible through the mist that hung low over the ground. The earth was covered in a carpet of fallen leaves, which rustled underfoot, creating a strange, barely perceptible sound, as if someone was following me. The further I ventured into the forest, the more foreign and almost hostile it seemed. The branches creaked under the pressure of the wind, as if whispering something to me. I was already thinking of turning back when I noticed it a house, old, abandoned, and almost entirely hidden behind the trees. Its wooden walls were covered in mold and moss, and the roof had sagged, looking like it might collapse at any moment. I stopped, examining it. Something about this house drew me closer, compelling me to investigate. I decided to take a closer look, although a voice in my head suggested I should leave. But curiosity got the better of me, and I moved forward. As I approached, I noticed that the doors of the house were wide open, as if someone had recently entered. I cautiously stepped inside, trying not to make any noise. The interior was dim, and the air was stale and heavy, tinged with the scent of dampness. The floors creaked underfoot, and each of my steps echoed softly against the walls. The rooms looked as though no one had lived in them for decades. Old, dilapidated furniture and walls covered in cobwebs gave the house a grim appearance. I was about to leave when I heard a strange noise coming from deep within the house, a quiet, barely audible rustling, as if someone was running their fingers along the walls. Holding my breath, I followed the sound. It led me to a staircase leading to the second floor. The stairs looked unreliable, but I decided to ascend. On the second floor, there were several doors, but one of them was slightly ajar, and that's where the sound was coming from. I slowly approached the door and pushed it open. The room was almost empty, except for an old, dust-covered mirror standing in the corner. In it, I saw my reflection pale, with traces of fear on my face. But for a moment, it seemed like someone was standing behind me. I quickly turned around, but there was no one there. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I was about to leave when I noticed that the reflection in the mirror had changed. Instead of my face, there was a distorted, grotesque visage with empty black eyes. I couldn't move. Fear paralyzed me. Then it spoke, whispering words I couldn't understand. It was an inhuman voice, cold and sinister. I bolted from the room, feeling something invisible grab my shoulder, trying to hold me back. I rushed downstairs, barely feeling my legs. The door I had entered through slammed shut in front of me, and I felt like something was watching me. Something was getting closer. In a panic, I started searching for another exit, but the house seemed to come alive. Its walls began to close in, and the floors creaked louder, as if the house was trying to trap me inside. I found a window and, without thinking, broke it and jumped out. The moment my feet touched the ground, I felt an icy hand grab my ankle, but I broke free and ran. I ran without looking back until I was out of the forest. When I finally stopped, my heart was still racing, and the fear wouldn't leave me. I looked back, but the house was no longer visible. Only dark trees surrounded me, and the mist was beginning to thicken. I returned home, but I couldn't forget what had happened. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that house, its grim walls, and the mirror with the face that stared at me from the darkness. I don't go into the woods anymore. Every time I hear the rustling of leaves or see an old, abandoned house, I'm gripped by fear. I know that what I saw was real, and I'm terrified that one day it will come back for me. Story 3: The house on the outskirts of town. I never liked this part of town. The outskirts always seemed bleak and neglected to me, but work often required me to travel there. On that day, I stayed late at the office, and by the time I finally stepped outside, it was already dark. The road home passed through an old, long-abandoned neighborhood that I always tried to avoid. But that evening, fatigue got the best of me, and I decided to take a shortcut. The wind was strong, blowing scraps of newspapers and dry leaves down the empty streets. The houses in this area looked as if no one had lived in them for decades. Dark windows, peeling paint on the walls, broken fences, all of it created an atmosphere of complete despair and desolation. I walked quickly, trying not to linger in this place any longer than necessary. But then I noticed something strange. One of the houses, which at first glance was no different from the others, seemed suspiciously familiar. It stood in the shadows of large trees, and I would have walked past it if not for the flicker of light in one of the windows. I stopped, trying to determine whether I had imagined it, but the light flickered again, as if someone had lit a candle or a flashlight inside. A strange feeling washed over me, a mix of fear and curiosity. It was unlikely that anyone could be living in such a house, but the thought that I might have missed something wouldn't let go. I approached and peeked into the window. The room inside was almost entirely empty, with only old, dust-covered furniture and torn wallpaper on the walls. There was no sign of the light anymore, and I was ready to dismiss it as a figment of my imagination. But then the door to the house, unexpectedly to me, was slightly ajar. A feeling of unease grew, but curiosity won out. I decided to enter, just to see what might have caught my attention. Inside, it was cold and dark. The air was musty, reminding me of dampness and mold. I walked down a narrow hallway leading deeper into the house. The floors creaked underfoot, and each step echoed through the empty rooms. The house seemed abandoned, but something was off. It felt like I wasn't alone, as if someone was watching me from the shadows. I reached a staircase leading to the second floor. The stairs looked sturdy, but every step I took on them was accompanied by a loud creak. I climbed slowly, feeling my heart pound harder with each step. Upstairs, there were several doors, but one of them was slightly open. I approached and pushed it. The room was almost empty, except for an old mirror in a heavy wooden frame hanging on the wall. It looked like no one had gazed into it for a long time. The surface was covered in dust, and the glass was murky. But what caught my attention wasn't the mirror, but the strange sensation that someone was standing behind me. I froze, feeling an icy chill enveloping me from behind. The sense of an unseen presence became unbearable. I turned around, but there was no one there. Panicking, I headed for the exit, but the door suddenly slammed shut in front of me with a deafening bang. The walls began to close in, as if the house had come alive and wanted to trap me. I bolted back toward the stairs, but heard a strange sound, a whisper coming from everywhere. The voices were unintelligible, but with each step, I began to understand that they were repeating the same word, "Come back." Terror gripped me, and I dashed for the exit, but the house wouldn't let me go. The floor began to vibrate, the walls closed in even more, and it felt like I was suffocating in this confined space. I ran down the stairs, stumbling and nearly falling. Finally, I reached the door and yanked the handle with all my strength. The door wouldn't budge, but suddenly it flew open, releasing me outside. I tumbled to my knees, breathing heavily. The house stood silently, dark and lifeless. But I knew it hadn't truly let me go. Something remained inside, something that was now watching me. Since then, I've been unable to shake the feeling that someone is watching me. Every night when I lie down to sleep, I feel eyes on me. In that house where I ventured, something lives, and that something now wants to come back to me. Sometimes at night, I hear a faint whisper calling me back, and I rise and go to the window, expecting to see that old, abandoned house on the outskirts of town. But it never appears. Only the whisper grows louder, as if someone desperately wants me to return. And each time I'm terrified that one day I won't be able to resist and will go back to where something terrible, something that should never have awakened, is waiting for me.